The lights beamed bright in the high-tech studio of Real Talk Tonight, one of the most watched political debate shows in America. Hosted by the ever-so-passionate and, some would say, overly dramatic liberal commentator Elliot Green, the show had gained notoriety for its heated debates, often leaving conservative guests feeling cornered. But tonight was different. Tonight's guest wasn't a politician or an economist. It wasn't a business mogul or a professor. No, tonight's guest was none other than Morgan Freeman, the legendary Hollywood icon with a voice smoother than aged whiskey and a mind sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. Known for his commanding presence, intellectual wit, and no-nonsense approach to conversations, Morgan had agreed to appear on the show for one simple reason. He was tired of seeing people talk at each other instead of with each other. And, as it would soon turn out, he had zero patience for nonsense. Elliot Green, dressed in his signature slim-fit navy suit, leaned forward with his rehearsed smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. Across from him, Morgan Freeman sat cool and composed, his deep brown eyes betraying nothing but quiet amusement. Mr. Freeman, first off, it's an absolute honor to have you on the show tonight, Elliot began, his voice dripping with that insincere media charm. Morgan tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a small smirk. That's usually how people start when they're about to say something foolish. The audience chuckled. Elliot's smile stiffened for a fraction of a second, but he pressed on. I wanted to start by asking you about your views on race in America. You've often spoken about it in your interviews, and some of your takes have been quite controversial. Morgan sighed, adjusting in his seat. Son, what's controversial to you is just common sense to me. The crowd let out a low ooh, sensing that they were in for a show. Elliot, unfazed or perhaps pretending to be, smiled wider. Well, let's get specific. You once said in an interview that the best way to stop racism is to stop talking about it. Morgan nodded. That's right. But Mr. Freeman, Elliot leaned in, how can we solve systemic injustices if we don't discuss them? Morgan folded his hands together and looked at Elliot as if he were a schoolboy asking why the sky is blue. Now, Elliot, I didn't say don't address injustices. I said stop making everything about race when it isn't. There's a difference. Elliot blinked. But, Morgan raised a hand. See, here's the problem with folks like you. You make race a business. The more you keep people divided, the more people tune in. The more they tune in, the more you get paid. Ain't that something? The crowd erupted into laughter and applause. Elliot's face twitched. That's not fair, Mr. Freeman. My job is to bring awareness to these issues. Morgan leaned back, shaking his head. Son, your job is to keep people angry. If folks stopped being mad at each other for 5 minutes, you'd be out of a job. Boom. Another shot fired. Elliot adjusted his tie, clearly flustered. But he wasn't about to let Morgan Freeman steal his show. All right, let's shift gears, Elliot said, forcing a chuckle. Let's talk politics. You've never been very vocal about your party affiliation, but it seems clear that you lean conservative. Would you say that's accurate? Morgan chuckled, his voice rich and full of wisdom. Son, I lean logical. But if that sounds conservative to you, maybe you should ask yourself why. The audience went wild. Elliot swallowed hard. He knew this was going to be a tough interview, but he vastly underestimated just how effortlessly Morgan Freeman could dismantle a weak argument. And the night was just getting started. The tension in the studio was as thick as molasses. Elliot Green, ever the polished host, tried to maintain his composure, but the audience could tell he was rattled. Morgan Freeman, on the other hand, remained as cool as a winter breeze, his relaxed posture making it clear that he was playing a game of verbal chess, and Elliot was already several moves behind. Elliot forced a grin. Okay, Mr. Freeman, let's talk about the bigger picture. You say you lean logical, but don't you think logic sometimes ignores lived experiences? What about all the communities suffering from wealth inequality, healthcare disparities, systemic oppression? Morgan let out a soft chuckle, his deep voice reverberating through the studio like a preacher delivering a sermon. Son, I was born in 1937 in Jim Crow, Mississippi. I know what real oppression looks like. And let me tell you something. Back then, when we had real barriers, you know what folks did? Elliot blinked, unsure if this was a rhetorical question. Morgan continued, undeterred. We worked our way through it. We built businesses. We got educated. We didn't sit around waiting for a news anchor to tell us how oppressed we were every night. The audience burst into applause. Elliot cleared his throat. But Mr. Freeman, today's struggles are different. We're dealing with systemic issues that... Morgan leaned forward slightly, eyes locked onto Elliot's with an intensity that could make a man's soul tremble. Systemic, huh? That's a mighty big word for something that sounds a lot like excuses. The audience lost it. Laughter, claps, even a few whistles rang out. Elliot's face reddened. It's not an excuse. It's a fact. Look at income inequality, the education gap. Morgan sighed, shaking his head. Let me ask you something, Elliot. If a man wakes up every morning and blames the system for his failures, but another man with the same circumstances wakes up and grinds every day to improve his life, who do you think is going to be more successful? Elliot hesitated. Morgan smiled knowingly. Exactly. The crowd roared. Elliot pressed his lips together, glancing at his notes as if looking for an escape route. He was losing control and the audience could feel it. All right, Elliot said, raising his hands. Let's get real then. What would you say to young people today who feel like the system is against them? Morgan clasped his hands together, his voice dropping to that iconic, smooth baritone that made every word feel like gospel. I tell them this. You are your own biggest obstacle. The moment you believe someone else controls your success, you've already lost. Stop waiting for a handout. Stop blaming invisible enemies. Go out there and earn what you want. The applause was deafening. Some members of the audience even stood up. Elliot, visibly shaken, rubbed his forehead. He had faced tough guests before, but this wasn't just a debate. This was a masterclass in common sense, and he was failing. You're saying systemic issues don't exist at all? Elliot challenged, his voice betraying his desperation. Morgan shook his head. No, I'm saying they exist, but they don't have to define you. You can choose to be a victim or you can choose to be a victor. But you can't be both. The studio erupted. Elliot Green had officially lost control of his own show, and Morgan Freeman was just getting started. The studio was electric. The audience wasn't just watching a debate. They were witnessing a performance. Morgan Freeman wasn't just answering questions, he was teaching lessons. And poor Elliot Green? He was barely holding on, like a man trying to keep a house of cards from collapsing in a windstorm. Elliot straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and forced another diplomatic smile. Okay, Mr. Freeman, you've made your stance clear. But let's shift gears a little. A lot of young people today feel disillusioned with capitalism. They believe the system is rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful. Would you say that's a fair concern? Morgan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. So let me get this straight. A generation that grew up with smartphones in their hands, streaming services giving them endless entertainment, and the ability to make money from their couch is oppressed by capitalism. The audience erupted in laughter. Elliot's smile twitched. I'm not saying. Morgan raised a hand. No. Let's really think about this. These same kids spend all day on TikTok, making videos, getting paid through sponsorships, ordering food at the tap of a button, and then turn around and say, capitalism is evil? Son, that's like eating a 5-star meal and complaining that food exists. The crowd went wild. People clapped. Some whistled. Even the camera operator was shaking from laughing. Elliot looked flustered. That's an oversimplification. Morgan wasn't done. Let me tell you something about the real world, Elliot. When I was young, if you wanted to make something of yourself, you worked. You didn't wait for someone to fix the system for you. You learned a skill, you provided value, and you earned your keep. But not everyone has the same opportunities, Elliot interjected quickly. Morgan let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Son, opportunities don't come prepackaged. You don't just sit around waiting for a job to knock on your door. You create opportunities by being useful. More applause. Some members of the audience were nodding vigorously. Elliot, clearly scrambling, tried a different angle. Okay, let's talk about wealth. You're a wealthy man yourself, Mr. Freeman. You have millions. Don't you think it's fair that the ultra-rich should pay more in taxes to support those who are struggling? Morgan smirked. Ah, there it is. The tax the rich argument. You know, Elliot, I pay my fair share of taxes. You do too, I assume. Elliot nodded hesitantly. Morgan leaned in. Then tell me something. If the government can't manage the trillions they already collect, what makes you think giving them more money will fix anything? The audience roared with approval. Elliot's jaw clenched. He had no good answer for that. Morgan continued, his voice steady and firm. People love to blame the rich for their problems. But let me ask you, who's responsible for your financial situation? You or Jeff Bezos? You or Elon Musk? If you're broke, is that their fault? Or is it because you made bad decisions? A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. People were thinking. Elliot cleared his throat. I think what people are saying is that the system makes it harder for some to climb the ladder. Morgan nodded. You mean it requires work? Imagine that. Laughter erupted once again. Elliot Green was now visibly sweating. He had walked into this interview thinking he could outwit an 87-year-old actor. Instead, he was being verbally dunked on repeatedly, and the audience loved it. And Morgan Freeman? He was just getting warmed up. Elliot Green was no stranger to tough interviews. He had sparred with senators, clashed with economists, and even argued with a billionaire or two. But this was different. This wasn't just a debate, this was survival. And right now, he was drowning in a sea of common sense. Desperate to regain control, Elliot adjusted his posture and forced another smile. Mr. Freeman, I think you're oversimplifying things. Not everyone has the same starting point in life. Some people grow up with privilege, while others face systemic barriers that hold them back. Don't you think that's a valid argument? Morgan exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Privilege. There's that word again. You know, when I was growing up, we didn't sit around talking about privilege. We worked with what we had and made the best of it. Elliot jumped in, sensing an opening. But Mr. Freeman, you're an exception. That's why people admire you. But not everyone can become a Hollywood star. Morgan chuckled, his voice rich and full of amusement. Son, if you think the only way to succeed in America is by becoming a Hollywood star, then I see why you're confused. The audience roared. Elliot flinched but pushed forward. All right, let's talk about fairness. A lot of young people today feel like the American dream is dead. They see the cost of living rising, wages stagnating, and corporations exploiting workers. How do you expect them to succeed in such an unfair system? Morgan gave him a long, patient look before responding. You ever played chess, Elliot? Elliot blinked. What? Chess? Morgan repeated. You ever played it? Yes, I have. Good, Morgan said with a nod. Then you know this, everyone starts with the same pieces. But not everyone wins, do they? Elliot hesitated. Well, no, but why don't they win? Morgan pressed. Elliot fumbled for words. I suppose some players are just more skilled than others. Morgan snapped his fingers. Exactly. And life's the same way. It ain't about fairness. It's about skill. You don't win by complaining that the other guy has a better strategy. You learn the game and play it better. The audience exploded into applause. Elliot swallowed hard. That's not. I mean, some people don't even get a chance to play. Morgan raised an eyebrow. Son, if you're in America, you're already on the board. The only question is whether you're gonna move or sit there whining about how unfair the game is. Boom. Another direct hit. Elliot was visibly flustered now. His fingers gripped the edge of the table like he was holding onto dear life. All right, let's try a different angle, he muttered, flipping through his notes frantically. Morgan leaned back, folding his hands. By all means, son. This is your show. The crowd laughed again. Elliot was losing, and he knew it, but he still had one last trick up his sleeve. Elliot Green's confidence had been battered like a rowboat in a hurricane. Every argument he threw at Morgan Freeman was met with a cool, effortless counter that left the audience roaring in approval. He had one last chance to regain control. If he didn't, he'd be the guy who got roasted by Morgan Freeman on live TV. He took a deep breath. "All right, Mr. Freeman, let's talk about racism." The audience murmured. They knew this was about to get interesting. Morgan smiled knowingly. "Ah, now we're getting to the real topic." "Huh." Elliot nodded. "You've said before that racism isn't the biggest barrier to success in America today. But many people, especially young people, feel differently. They see racial bias in hiring, in policing, in education. Are you saying those concerns aren't valid?" Morgan sighed and tilted his head. "Let me tell you a story, Elliot. You know how I got my first acting job?" Elliot blinked. How?" Morgan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into that deep, rich tone that could make a grocery list sound like scripture. "I walked into an audition and earned it." The audience chuckled. "But surely you faced discrimination along the way?" Elliot pressed. Morgan nodded. "Of course I did. Back in my day, racism was a real, tangible force. But you know what I didn't do? I didn't sit around blaming it for everything. I worked harder. I got so damn good they had to hire me. And let me tell you something. Nobody can stop you when you're undeniable." The crowd erupted. Some people even stood up, clapping. Elliot stammered. So you're saying racism doesn't exist anymore?" Morgan shook his head. "No, son. I'm saying it exists, but it doesn't have to define you. The moment you let it, you've already lost." The audience exploded again. Even the camera crew was shaking their heads in admiration. Elliot wiped his brow. He had one last card to play. "But don't you think it's unfair to expect everyone to just push through racism like you did?" Morgan chuckled, his voice smooth as ever. "You know what's really unfair, Elliot? Telling people they're helpless. Telling them the world is against them. Telling them they can't win because of their skin color. That's not helping them. It's crippling them." The audience lost it. Elliot was done. He knew it. The cameras knew it. America knew it. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was history. Elliot Green was in shambles. His face glistened with sweat under the studio lights, and his once confident demeanor had crumbled into visible desperation. Morgan Freeman, on the other hand, was as relaxed as ever, sitting back in his chair like a man who had already won. But Elliot refused to go down without swinging. He straightened his posture, took a deep breath, and forced another tight smile. "Mr. Freeman," he said, his voice slightly strained, "I think we can agree that society has flaws, that there are still inequalities. Wouldn't you say that, at the very least, the government has a role in fixing those inequalities?" Morgan raised an eyebrow. "The government?" He let the words hang in the air for a moment before chuckling. "Son, let me ask you something. You ever been to the DMV?" The audience laughed. Even Elliot smirked, though he didn't like where this was going. Morgan continued, "The same government that can't figure out how to process a driver's license efficiently is going to fix society? The same folks that spent $2 million studying shrimp on treadmills are supposed to manage equality." The crowd erupted in laughter. Elliot put up a hand. "That's not what I meant." Morgan leaned forward, his expression serious. "Listen, Elliot. You want to know the real problem? Too many people want someone else to solve their problems for them. The government should fix it. The rich should fix it. Someone else should fix it. You ever notice how the loudest complainers are usually the ones doing the least to fix anything themselves?" More applause. Elliot's frustration boiled over. "So what, Mr. Freeman? Are you saying people should just accept that life is unfair and deal with it on their own?" Morgan's eyes twinkled. "Now you're catching on, son." The audience lost it. Elliot clenched his jaw. He was done. He had nothing left. Morgan glanced at him with a knowing smile. "You're a smart man, Elliot, but let me give you a little advice. If you spend all your time blaming other people for what's wrong in the world, you'll never have time to fix your own problems." The final mic drop. The crowd exploded. Standing ovation. Cheers. Laughter. Elliot sighed, rubbing his temples. "Well," he muttered into the microphone, I think it's safe to say that was the Morgan Freeman masterclass. Morgan chuckled. Happy to help. And with that, the greatest roast in television history came to an end. But on the internet, it was just getting started. The moment the broadcast ended, the internet exploded. Clips of Morgan Freeman roasting Elliot Green spread like wildfire. Within minutes, memes flooded social media. One particularly viral clip showed Morgan shaking his head with the caption, "You don't win by complaining. You learn the game and play it better." Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, everywhere you looked, Morgan Freeman was the trending topic. Hashtag Freeman facts started going viral. People were making up Chuck Norris-style jokes, but with Morgan Freeman's wisdom instead of roundhouse kicks. Morgan Freeman doesn't lose debates. He just lets people embarrass themselves. Morgan Freeman didn't read the script. The script read him. Morgan Freeman doesn't argue. He narrates your downfall. Meanwhile, Elliot Green's name started trending for all the wrong reasons. Hashtag Elliot Obliterated climbed the ranks as people dissected the beating he had taken on live television. Someone even edited a compilation video titled, Elliot Green, the man who got schooled by Morgan Freeman. It was a 12-minute montage of Elliot getting roasted, complete with dramatic zoom-ins and sound effects. By morning, it had hit 5 million views. Elliot's damage control. Elliot Green knew he had to act fast. The media sharks were already circling, waiting for him to respond. He went live on his own social media trying to spin the situation. "Look, guys," he began, his smile strained. Obviously, Mr. Freeman is a very intelligent man, and I respect his perspective. But I think a lot of people are taking this out of context. That was his first mistake. The comments section torched him. "Bro, just take the L and log off. Morgan Freeman ended your whole career, and you still trying to talk? Dude, we saw the debate. There is no context." Elliot shut off the live stream within minutes. The internet wasn't buying it. Morgan Freeman's response. And what was Morgan Freeman doing while the world erupted over his interview? Sipping tea on his porch. When reporters asked for a response, he just chuckled. "Son," he said in that legendary voice, "I've said what I needed to say." Classic Freeman. The internet ate it up. His silence only made the moment more legendary. The final verdict. Over the next few days, the clip continued to dominate headlines. Late-night hosts made jokes about it. YouTubers analyzed it. Even political commentators weighed in. Morgan Freeman had done what few people ever could. He had won the entire internet without even trying. And Elliot Green? Well, let's just say his TV ratings were never quite the same again. Elliot Green sat alone in his dimly lit office, staring at his phone screen. His notifications were a war zone. Every single post about him was a joke. Every meme, every clip, every sarcastic tweet, his credibility was in shambles. Bro got cooked by Morgan Freeman on national TV. You either die a host or live long enough to become a meme. Someone check on Elliot, man. That was a career-ending L. He groaned and slammed his phone down. The worst part? Even his friends weren't defending him. His producer, Lisa, hesitated before walking into the room. "Elliot, listen. I know this has been rough, but we have to respond." Elliot rubbed his face. "I did respond. I went live, and the internet tore me apart." Lisa sighed. "Yeah, because you sounded like you were making excuses instead of owning it." Elliot looked up, offended. "So what do you want me to do? Laugh along with them? Pretend this is funny?" Lisa sat across from him, folding her arms. "Actually, yeah, you should laugh along with them. That's the only way out of this." Elliot shook his head. "That's insane." Lisa leaned forward. "No, it's survival. If you keep fighting this, people will keep roasting you. But if you own it, if you lean into the meme, you might just flip the script." Elliot exhaled. He hated this, but deep down he knew Lisa was right. So, a few hours later, Elliot took to Twitter and posted, "Breaking news. I have officially retired from debating Morgan Freeman. Thoughts and prayers appreciated." Within minutes, it exploded. Even people who had been roasting him started to respect the move. Okay, I'll admit, this is a W. Elliot embracing the L? I respect it. Man finally got some self-awareness. And then, the unthinkable happened. Morgan Freeman himself responded. His official account simply replied, "You'll live, son." The internet lost it. Elliot Green, the man who had been obliterated on live television, had finally done something right. And just like that, the healing began. But one thing was for sure. He would never debate Morgan Freeman again. While Elliot Green was busy licking his wounds and trying to salvage his reputation, Morgan Freeman was living his best life. The viral moment had cemented him as more than just an acting legend. He was now an internet icon. News outlets kept replaying clips of the debate. Late-night hosts joked about it. Even Saturday Night Live did a skit where an actor, doing a terrible Morgan Freeman impression, debated a clueless host, only to end it with, "Son, you just lost a battle you shouldn't have fought." But the real moment that broke the internet? When Morgan Freeman went on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. As soon as he walked on stage, the audience gave him a standing ovation. Jimmy, barely holding back laughter, showed him a tweet on the big screen. Morgan Freeman didn't argue. He narrated Elliot Green's funeral in real time. Morgan read it, chuckled, and in that voice, said, "It was at this moment." Elliot knew. He had messed up. The audience went wild. The internet did too. Within hours, the clip had racked up millions of views. Hollywood takes notice. In the aftermath of the debate, something unexpected happened. Morgan Freeman started getting new kinds of job offers. Netflix reached out, offering him a documentary deal. Freeman Roasts the World, a deep dive into society's biggest debates, featuring Morgan Freeman destroying arguments with pure wisdom. Comedy Central pitched a one-time special. Morgan Freeman, masterclass in verbal smackdowns. Even companies jumped in. A coffee brand wanted to market a new slogan. "Our roast isn't as strong as Morgan Freeman's." Meanwhile, poor Elliot Green? He was still recovering. He had started leaning into the joke, but his career had definitely taken a hit. One late-night host summed it up perfectly. Elliot Green's career isn't over. It's just resting in peace. And as for Morgan, he was just sitting back, sipping his tea, letting the legend grow. Because when you're that good, you don't chase the internet chases you.